So I'm recording now. As usual, I'm just recording my screen and only my audio. So feel free to ask questions or use the chat whenever you need to. And so let's talk about a loop. So I'm gonna open up the console over here just to do some examples over there as well, and then open these notes. And I'll put a link to this in the voice chat so you guys can reference that. And we'll get started. Uh-oh, I'm gonna have to reset this. Oops. Okay, there we go. Okay, so we're talking about loops. Loops are common to all languages, but they have different names for them in different languages. There are three basic loops in JavaScript. The one that we're going to use most is the for loop. I'm going to talk about the other ones just as an example, just so you guys are aware of them. But the one that we're going to use for our homework and for all of the examples is a for loop. And in a lot of modern languages, the for loop is kind of the most common. So if you are writing Java or C++ or something like that, you'll probably be using for loops a lot. Um, in other languages like Python and stuff like that, you probably won't see a for loop, but it just kind of depends on the language. There's some version of something that does the same thing. Um, and all loops are basically used for the same reason, and that is to repeat a set of commands. So when we're programming, we often want to do something more than once. And so we have structures that allow us to do that. So instead of having to write, ellipse 10 times or rectangle 10 times to draw a bunch of circles or squares, we can use a for loop and change the parameters to decide how we want to draw them. So it's a really useful programming technique, and it's one of the fundamental ones that any programmer will need to use. And so I'll try to go over the basic syntax of a loop and then show some practical examples. So last week we looked at conditional statements, and loops actually look very similar. They just add a little bit to it. So as an example, if I have a conditional statement like if, let's just say true, then I'm going to console.log. This is a conditional statement. So when I execute this code, uh, it's just going to log this is a conditional statement. And an if statement is really just to do something once, either if it's true or not. So if I run the same code, but I change this to false, if I spell false correctly, there's no log, because if something's false, then we don't do whatever is inside of our conditional code scope, so in between the two brackets. And so that's one type of control structure. We're just saying if we want to do something or not. Uh, a loop is going to add a level of complexity to that, but it's not just saying if something is true, it's also saying if something is true more than once, or for how many times is something true. And so a while loop is an example of a loop that looks a lot like a for loop, but it's a little bit different. You can see here uh, this code as an if statement, and this code replacing if with while, and you're going to see they have two different outcomes. So I'll start with variable I equals 0. And so I'm just going to execute that. So now I have this I value that's equal to 0. And now if I wanted to do something once with the condition, I could say if I is less than 5. So that's true because I is just 0. Then I'm going to say I plus plus. So I'm going to add 1 to I, which is a very common thing that we want to do in programming. And then I'm just going to log that. So I'm going to console.log I, and then I'm going to close my code. So if I execute this, if I just hit enter here, we get that console.log right there. There's 1. So we know that I is equal to 1, but then it's just an if statement. So our program is over. It just stops there. So if we replace this with while, we're going to see something different happen. So if I initialize I at 0 again, and now all I'm doing here is I'm replacing if with while. And you can kind of think about it in terms of what the term while means. While something is true, do something else. So while I is less than 5, Now we're still going to say I++, and now we're going to console.log I. So now when I run this, see the difference. I've logged 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So a loop, like the while loop or the for loop that we'll do in a second, whoops, that's from earlier. Let's delete that. Okay. So a loop does things repeated times. And in order to do something multiple times, we have to create conditions for when it starts and when it ends. One of the reasons we're not going to use while loops very often is because they're kind of dangerous to use. So for example, if I forgot to write I++ here, then I would never change and my computer would crash basically, or my browser at least would crash, maybe not my whole computer, because I would create a condition where my code would never stop running. Because I would say while I is less than 5, if I just console.log I and I never update it, then I'm never going to get to a point where I is greater than 5, which is what ends the while loop. So that's why we're going to use a for loop, but it's good to use a while loop as an example because it matches the if statement very closely. But a for loop basically just puts everything together. So anyway, let's talk about what happened here in the code. So we started with variable I equals 0. Okay, so I is 0 up here. And then we asked this question, while I is less than 5. So is 0 less than 5? Yes, that's true. Okay, if that's true, then we run everything in between our brackets here. And so the first thing that we do is we increment I, we say I++. So now I is 1. And then we console.log I. So that's why we see I right here. And I'm just doing that as an example just to show that what it's doing. So then in a loop, the difference between a loop and an if statement is an if statement at that point is just done. We just move on to the next bit of our code. A while loop or any other type of loop will go back to the beginning and check to see if the condition is still true. So once we console.log I, our code ends here and we loop back to the beginning and we ask the question again. So now I is 1. Is 1 less than 5? Yes, obviously that's true. So we do our code again. So we increment I++, that's 2. We log I, so here's the 2 down here. And then we loop back to the beginning. We check the condition again. 2 is less than 5. That's still true. Okay, so we increment I again. Now it's 3. We log I again. There's our 3. And we go back to the beginning. 3 is less than 5. This is still true. Increment I is 4. Log I, there's 4. Loop back to the beginning. Is 4 less than 5? Okay, it still is, so we're going to keep going. So we're going to increment again. Now we get to 5. We're going to log I again. There's our 5. And we're going to loop back to the beginning. Now we're going to say, is 5 less than 5? And here is where we end, because 5 is not less than 5. Of course, this is the condition we chose. We can change that condition. But in this case, 5 is no longer less than 5. So that means our condition is now false. So that means our loop is over. So that's why we never go past 5 here. Now we're done with our loop. So with a loop, we can do a lot of cool stuff, but it's a little bit tricky because we have to set up our conditions correctly to make the loop work. Oops. Uh-oh. Okay. I almost accidentally logged out of my computer. Okay, so let's keep going. So here's our for loop, and this is much safer because all of our conditions are put in the same place, as whereas the while loop, we have our conditions in different places. So we're going to write the exact same loop, this time with the for loop. So to do that, we say for, and then we still have the same basic setup, like we have if condition code, or we have while condition code. With a for loop, we have the same thing, we just have more conditions that get stuck into those parentheses. So we say for, and we say variable I equals 0, and I is less than 5, and I plus plus. So you can see that all of the conditions that we had previously in our previous slide are there. We start with variable I equals 0. That goes into the first condition of our for loop. Then we have our main condition, I is less than 5 for how long we do our loop. And then we have our update statement, I++, so that I changes, because I has to change if our loop is going to end at some point. I, by the way, I didn't really explain this, is what we often use in programming. It's sort of a weird reason why. It's just because I was one of the letters that was still kind of available in early programs, because a lot of the other letters stood for other things. But we also can sort of say that it stands for index, because when we're counting, we often have an index which says what count you're at. So anyway, to finish my for loop, but you don't have to use I. My point is you can use whatever letter you want or variable name. So I can say console.log I, and we're going to get the same result here. So with just one line of code, we get we get this action repeated 5 times. Okay, so that's how we construct our for loop. And now let's look at a few ways that we can vary our for loop. So this first statement is the initial condition, which is our variable I equals 0. Then we have our conditional statement, which is when we want the loop to end. And it's a little bit backwards because it's like as long as this thing is true, we're going to keep going. And when it turns to false, that's when the loop ends. Then we have our update or iteration or incrementation statement, increment statement, whatever you want to call it, is that I++. One little thing actually, so you'll notice that in these examples, when I started using the for loop, I started using let instead of var. Var and let are essentially the same thing, but let is scoped. So let doesn't exist outside of the for loop. So it's not super important. It's probably not going to make a huge difference in your code, but I'll just do a couple quick examples. So if I say for, let's say variable x equals 0, x is less than 2, x++, and then I just say console.log x. So x still exists. I can run this code and it uses x to count, and then if I log x again, or if I do a statement with x, like x plus 2, x still exists. So when I use variable, the variable that I create is going to exist in my software no matter where it is. Let only exists inside of the structure that I'm using it in. So if I say for let y equals 0, y is less than 2, or let's just say y is less than 1, y++, console.log y. So now I did the same for loop basically, but y, the variable, doesn't exist anymore. And so this is a little bit better because we can use a variable to do our for loop, but then just ignore it later. We don't have to worry about overwriting it or it interfering with other variables in our code. So that's why I'll use let a lot of the time when I'm using a for loop as opposed to var. It doesn't really make a big difference, so you probably won't really need to worry about it too much, but it is, a little bit better for loops. Okay, so we can adjust our for loop to do different things, to count different amounts. And so we can change all of these conditions. So a lot of for loops are going to look like this. For let I equals 0, I is less than some value, whether it's 10 or whatever, I++. This is like your, sort of like bread and butter for loop that you'll see a million times. And then we're going to do something with I. Let's say console.log I plus loop. So we'll do something with that, and then we'll execute our loop. We can change all those values though. So we can change where I starts. It doesn't have to start at 0. We can change where it ends. It doesn't have to end at 10. And we can even change the amount that it changes each time we go through the loop. So if I want to count from 1 to 5 instead of 0 to 4, I could say for let I equals 1. And then here's where I have to be careful about what my condition is. So if I say I is less than 5, I'm going to stop at 5. So I can either, or I'm going to stop at 4 because 4 is less than 5. So I can either say I less than or equal to 5, so then we'll keep going at 5, or I can change this to 6. Either one of those will work. So let's say I want to count to 5. I'll say I is less than or equal to 5, I plus plus, and then console.log I plus loop. And there we go. We have 1 loop, 2 loop, 3 loop, 4 loop, 5 loop. So I can change these numbers to whatever I want. I can change 5 to 10. So now we have 10 loops. I can change 10 to 100. Now we have 100 loops. I can change it to 1,000. There we go, 1,000 loops. Notice that these happen instantaneously. They're not like, it's not like the draw loop where it's like every frame is updating. This happens instantly. The computer just does all of them at the exact, as soon as you say to do it. So it doesn't really matter how many loops I tell it to do. I can tell it to do 1,000,000 loops and it'll just do it for me. Whoops. Actually, that one took a little while. That's probably because the console is not very efficient. This is kind of funny, actually. I hope I didn't crash this. Yeah, I think I did. Oh, no, I think it just finished. Okay, so you can't do 1,000,000 loops instantaneously, but you can do close to 1,000,000. Oh, it's still going. Wow. Yeah, so this is another reason why you have to be careful about loops, even if you're using a for loop. Let's see if I clear this. Is it going to keep going? Okay, I think it's good. Whoops. So let's change some other stuff. So let's not count to 1,000,000 anymore. Let's just count to 10. But I can also change this number here. So I can start counting at 5 and go up to 10. And I can change this number over here as well. I can count by 2s if I want. So 5, 7, 9. So all of those values are just different ways that we can control how many times we count and what values we count through our loop. We can also go backwards. So that's another example you see here. If I start at I equals 10 and I say I is greater than 0, I minus minus, I can count backwards. Okay, so I start at 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So if you want to count backwards, that's something that you can do. It just kind of depends on what you're asking your program to do. Okay, so let's draw with some loops. We're going to do some examples over in P5, and I'm going to show these examples, but I'll go over here. Actually, let's just go through them because I think I know. Okay, so without a loop, if I want to draw 5 circles on my canvas, I would have to write the same code 5 times. I'd have to say circle, and let's say it's at 100, 100, 100. Okay, so there we have a circle. Let's put another circle at 200 to 100, 100. We'll just put it right next to it. And we'll put another circle at 300. And we'll put another circle. So as programmers, excuse me, as programmers, whenever we see something like this, where I'm writing the same exact code over and over again. Oh, we can't see all our circles, so let's make our canvas a little bigger. If I see something like that, where my code looks almost exactly the same line after line after line, as a programmer, I'm going to think to myself, this is not the best way to do this, because as programmers, we can manipulate the computer, we can use math, we can use different programming structures, and we can save ourselves a lot of time ultimately by using things like loops. Excuse me. So, writing circle 5 times isn't that big of a deal, but if you have a much more complex pattern with lots of different shapes and different things that are going on, repeating that over and over again is going to start to get really annoying. So what we can do is look at this code, and if we want to make a loop, so let's take some notes. So we can use a loop to repeat code. The thing that we have to figure out is what's the same and what's different. So what is the same and what is changing? So if I look at these 5 lines, each one is a circle, so that's staying the same. Here's the X value. That's where it shows up on the canvas. So the first one is at 100, second one is at 200, 300, 400, 500. So that number is changing, and it's changing, significantly. Next, this 100 for the Y, that one's staying the same. My, excuse me, my circles are not moving up and down, they're only moving across, at least so far. So my Y is just 100, 100, 100, 100. Finally, the size of the circle is also staying the same. So each circle has the same size. So I can repeat all of those things with a loop as long as I can change the X value. Excuse me. So I'm going to show you guys a couple different ways to do this because we can use math to do different things. So if I want to analyze this code and think about how to do it with a loop, I want to look at what my starting condition is. So X starts at 100. So my starting condition is X equals 100. My ending condition is when X equals 500. So end when X is greater than 500 or greater than or equal to 500. And then how much is it changing each time? Well, it's changing by 100. 100 plus 100 gets to 200 plus 100 gets to 300. So then it's changing by 100 each time, or we can say X equals X plus 100, or we can just say X plus equals 100. So now I have all the conditions I need for my loop. So let's comment this out and write a for loop. I'll move this down here. So I can say for, and then my first condition is let X equal 100. So then the next condition is when do I end? So I don't want to go over 500. So I can say I should end if X is greater than 500. So we'll keep going. When we hit 500, we're going to say stop. So then how much do we increment by? We say X plus equals 100. So now I have this variable here, which is changing inside of my loop. So I can recreate these 5 lines of code with one single line of code. I can say circle, X is now the X position, Y stays the same, Y is 100, and size is the same, size is 100. And what did we miss? Okay, did I get an error? Okay. What happened? Oh no, I got this backwards. X is less than or equal to 500. My bad. So end when X is greater than 500, but that means that we need to create the condition is true. So true condition is X is less than or equal to 500. So even I get confused about that sometimes. Okay, so there's our 5 circles with one line of code inside of a for loop. So if we can analyze what we want to draw and how we want it to change, then we can create a for loop. And the nice thing about this isn't that exciting because we could already draw 5 circles pretty easily. But the nice thing about this is now I can draw 5 self-portraits, I can draw 5 flowers, I can draw 5, designs, and then I can repeat them as many times as I want to. So I can create patterns. And so that's something that programming and code is really good at that we're not necessarily as good at on our own, is creating patterns with, a larger palette. So I can change things about this. I could start X at 0. I could move X all the way to the end of the canvas by going up to 600. I can increment X by a smaller number, like 10. Now I have tons of circles. I could do it by 50. I could do it by 200, so then I'm only going to have a few circles. So all these parameters change aspects of the pattern. As you kind of play around with it, you'll kind of get used to what does what, but they all kind of have a specific component that they change. Okay, So another way that we could do this, remember in a lot of the examples, I was using I, and I was just counting. If we want to count instead of using the space of the canvas as our way of counting, we can still count, and then we can just figure out what is I or what is X based on I. So I can make another loop. I can say for let I equals 0, I is less than, let's say I want 5 circles, so I'm just going to say 5 here, and then I plus plus. And you don't have to start at 0. In programming, we tend to start at 0. 0 is technically the first number because it comes before 1. So even though in real life we tend to count starting with 1, in programming, we tend to count starting with 0. Anyway, it doesn't really matter what number we use there. Now, let's say I draw a circle. If I draw a circle at I, they're not really going to be, it's not really going to be that useful. So I'm going to move it down a little bit, and it just looks like there's one circle, right? Because I is a tiny number. I is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So they're all basically in the same place. But I can use I can use math with I to figure out where I want it to go. So instead of I, let's use x, and let's calculate a new value for x. So we can say let x equal, and now I can say I, and I can multiply it by a number to spread out my pattern. So I could say I times 100. There we go. We have 5 circles. So we moved each time we use I, and we basically get the exact same thing, except we start at 0. So, I could change I to 1 and set this to less than or equal to 5. That would work as well. But I could also just offset my number. So I could say x equals I times 100 plus 100. And there we get a nice, now we have them all lined up. Or I could do a different offset, and now I could have, a more interesting pattern. I could also increase this number here, get a different offset that way. So we can actually just use math while we're counting to set the values inside of our loop. So that's another way to do it. Neither one is really, better. They're just different ways to do it. Okay. So let's look at a couple other things to actually add into this, and then we will move to workshop time. So with our loops, as I mentioned, now we can create more interesting patterns. So we can draw a bunch of stuff inside of our loops the way that we've usually just been drawing on the canvas in general. So here's a couple examples, a little self-portrait. I'll probably do that. And then we get into some variation. I'm going to skip this bit because that's what we're going to cover on Wednesday. So let's just talk about adding some patterns to this. Forgot to put my comment on here. Let's see, it's the 27th. Okay. Okay. So let's see. What should I do? I'll just use I'm trying to decide if I should use the first one or the second one. I guess I could do both. I could do different ones. Let's just do, I don't want to do a third one. Okay, actually, why not? Let's just copy this one, put it down here, put a little comment that says pattern, and we'll move Y down even farther. We'll go down to 300. There we go. And so now if I want to draw more stuff inside my loop, I can. Right now I'm just drawing one circle each time I loop over, but that's not the only thing I can do with a loop. I can add more stuff in here. The thing that I need to do though is I need to be careful to use the scope and the variables inside of this loop. So let's say I'm drawing my self-portrait as my basis for my pattern. And so let's say this circle is the face. And let's turn off the stroke for a second. And before I draw my face, let's give it a fill. I'll say plum. Oops. Okay, I have an error somewhere. Let's see what it is. Huh. I'm running into that weird error now. Okay, it doesn't like the fill. Okay, that's fine. I'm going to save this and I'm going to bring it over to an incognito window. And uh, I'll just change my settings real quick. Actually, I need to log in so that I don't, so I can save this. Okay, now we don't have an error. Or we still do. Okay. I don't know what's going on with that. Oh boy. Let's see if I try a different color. No. Okay. What if I log out? Okay, let's try. Okay, now this works. So I don't know what is going on because it's clearly just on my computer, on my Chrome, but we're just going to do this and I'll figure it out later. Okay, so we're going to make our pattern. We're going to fill in the face will be plum. Uh, I guess that changes everything. So let's set our defaults up here. Fill is 255. Stroke is 0. Okay. All right, so if we want to add eyes, we can do the same thing. We can basically make a circle, and it's the same thing that we were doing with our interaction and when we were using variables before. What I want to do is offset by the variable. So if I take a circle and I just say like 10 here, and then let's use the same y, and I'll use a smaller size for the eye, and I'll say this is the eye, and I'll change the fill so we can see that. So let's use gold. So if I just use a hard-coded number like 10, see that the I shows up over here because it's not relative to the loop. So even though I'm doing it a bunch of times, it's still inside of my loop. But if I'm not using that x, if I'm not using the value that's generated by the loop, then it doesn't really matter. So if I put x in here, now we have our dots. And I can add to this. I can still say plus 10. As long as I'm using x, it's going to keep going in our loop. And I can change the y value. I could say this is like 300 minus 10 or 20 or something like that. Let's do plus 20. And so now I've got my eyes. So I can copy this and do a similar thing I did with my self-portrait. I've got my two eyes. And so now I have like a pattern. I have something that's repeating, but it always looks the same. And so my loop is letting me do that without having to copy this big block of code a bunch of different times. Let's add in a mouth just to finish it off. So say rect mode is center. I'll put a rectangle at x, and we'll do 300 for the y plus 20, and we'll do 20 for the height, and 40 for the width, and 10 for the rounded edges. Oh, whoops, that kind of looks funny, but I swapped the width and the height that I intended. There we go. So there's my self-portrait, and now I can create this pattern. I can repeat it as many times as I want to. And if I change one number now, the whole thing changes. If I want to change the size, if I want to make them smaller, I could do that. And now I've got a smaller self-portrait, or maybe I need it to be a little bit bigger. Or if I want them to be really big, I could do 200 there. Then now they're kind of overlapping, so I may want to adjust the loop. But I have a lot more control that I can introduce into my programming abilities by using this loop structure. Okay, so it's not going to let me save this right now because I'm not logged in, but I'm going to select all this code and copy it and then paste it in here. And it's going to run, it's going to be an error, but that's okay because I know that it ran on the other place. So I'll save that and call this pattern loop example. Okay, and I'm gonna put this in the voice chat so you guys can take a look at that. And so for this first bit, we're gonna go over adding randomness and variation on Wednesday. So you'll be able to do some more interesting things there. But for now, just creating the pattern, all you really have to do, actually, let me just make a loop template because that's probably gonna be a lot easier. Let's uh, I'm just going to duplicate this. So I'm going to duplicate this, and I'm just going to delete. So these notes are useful probably, but just to kind of simplify things, let's delete all this stuff. And let's say pattern template. And I'm just going to take out my code and say draw pattern here. So give that a try. You can start. I have the example for you guys to take a look at, but you can also start using this pattern template. So you can just have that loop there and you can make adjustments to it, but you can add your own stuff in there. And just think of a pattern that you would want to make. Like it doesn't have to be a self-portrait pattern. It could be, abstract shapes. It could be flowers. It could be windows. It could be, anything that's like repeating. You could make a cool pattern out of. So that might be fun. And you could think about different things that you would use it on, like, wallpaper or t-shirt or socks or something like that. But it's just a chance to try to design something just with the pattern. Don't really think about anything else at this point. We just want to see how the loop kind of affects the design. Wednesday, as I mentioned, we'll talk about variation and adding randomness. So we can still have a pattern that looks the same, but we can vary different things if we want to create a little bit of change over the course of the pattern. So that's what we will look at on Wednesday. And then, yeah, the first pattern assignment is, as usual, due a week from today, next Monday. And, same basic thing, just submitting some documentation on OpenLab and then posting on Blackboard. Okay, so I'm going to stop here and then we'll do some workshop time.